Hello, this is Camille Fairborn from Utah State University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Cause Activity webinar. I'm filling in today for Lee Johnson, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Pamela Fellers, who is an assistant professor of statistics at Grinnell College. Her topic today will be the Bubble Project. The way the webinars work is that all listeners are muted during the webinar. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the chat box. We'll be sure to ask those questions toward the end and give Pam a chance to respond. You can also use the chat box if you're having any technical questions. And at this point, I'll turn things over to Pamela Fellers. Pam, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. So today I'm going to share a project that I began incorporating into my introductory class. I call it the Bubble Project. That's kind of became its name. So I teach at Grinnell College, and I've used this project in my class last fall as well as this spring. The class that I incorporated this project into is an applied statistics course. We have enrollments in that class between 25 and 30, depending on the need that semester. It does have a calculus prerequisite, although there's no part of this project that I would see would require that prerequisite. So I think it could be easily adapted or modified in any way without a calc background. I will note that this is not what I would call a refined or perfect project, but hopefully in sharing about this project, you might be inspired to incorporate something similar to fit your class and your needs. So that's kind of my goal, is to just share what I've done, why I included it, as well as some of the comments that I have from doing it for 2 semesters. So, no, it's not. There we go. So the brief outline is I'll go over the motivation for the project, why I kind of wanted to include it, an overview of the details. Since I did do it last fall and this spring, I slightly modified it. So I'll tell you briefly about the 2 ways I did it, as well as some comments about each ways, and then it's just a few comments of my experiences with including it in my course room. So the motivation really was, if thinking about the beginning content of an intro class, it's generally a review for some, potentially most students. So the beginning content is about numerical summaries, graphical summaries, that sort of thing. I'm seeing a lot more students coming out of high school with some sort of stats background, which is good to see. And so a lot of times the data collection method information might be the exception of what they haven't seen directly in a course. And so I wanted to find some additional ways of going over that content that didn't feel so review-oriented, where it's just giving the information. Another reason I wanted to incorporate this is that final projects tend to occur during the last half of the semester. In my courses, I include a final project where a group of students identify their own research question. They either collect or find their own data. They then analyze it and come up with a final product, whether that be a presentation, a poster, or a paper. All of that tends to occur at the back half. And so I wanted something that was sort of project-oriented towards the beginning, but not quite as in detailed because we hadn't covered as much content. And so that's where I kind of came up with my Bubble project. To me, this project introduces into that early content a variety of statistical thinking questions. So they need to think later on more big picture about, okay, not just, okay, this is a quantitative variable, this is how we can summarize it numerically and graphically, but thinking more big picture, like what part or what purpose does this variable serve, what questions am I answering, that sort of thing. It also gave extra exposure to the data collection methods in a sort of a hands-on way. And at the end, it served as sort of a nice reference for when they were working on their final projects. A lot of times I ended up saying, well, why don't you go look at your Bubble project? Do you remember how we structured that or how you had to address this concern? So to me, this bubble project kind of became a bridge to incorporating the early concepts in a project or research type situation, rather than just purely going through the material as it is. Some other motivations sort of for why I chose the bubbles. Bubbles are fun. It was low cost. So you can see so this is my little supply shelf that I took a picture of the other day. So those are extras. But the party bubbles are like $5 for all the large bubbles, and there's more than what's pictured there. You can buy them on clearance at the end of the summer, so they were like 75 cents for a package of 6. Soap and sugar. The sugar is missing, but I brought that from home. It's not that big of a deal. So the cost that goes into this is not much, and the students enjoyed working with bubbles. It's also a short-term project, so it was done within the first 4 weeks. So it gets the semester off to a start where they have something, not just individual assignments, but kind of a longer project. But again, it's still just a 4-week assignment. And then another thing that I really enjoyed incorporating was splitting them up into random group assignments right away. So again, it got them working with others in the class, people they didn't know. They then met 3 or 4 others, depending on the group sizes, and so it got the students working together in a project. So that was kind of the motivation, the reasons why I chose the bubbles, as well as just incorporating this type of a project. So a brief overview of the project, sort of the details of what I had them do. I'm going to go over that first, and then I will talk about sort of the 2 ways that the 2 modifications, so how it was specific for each of the semesters that I did it. Again, like I said, I randomly assigned their teams. These were 3 to 5 students, depending on the class size in the semester. All teams were given the same research prompt. So their goal was to determine what was the best bubble solution. I made it vague for a reason. I wanted them to then work through refining that research question. And then I had 2 different scenarios that each team was given one of these 2 guidelines or restriction scenarios. So half the groups had access to 3 containers each of 2 brands of bubble solution. So here they were given pre-made, bought-in bubble solution, although there are 2 different brands. And they were also limited to 3 containers, so they had to think about supply limitations. The second half of the groups were given a recipe to follow. So you can see at the bottom a cup of water, 1/4 a cup of dishwashing liquid, and 2 teaspoons of sugar. And as a group, they needed to choose one of the elements, either the dishwashing liquid or the sugar, to vary, to come up with either 2 or 3 treatments total, where one of the treatments was this recipe as made, and then they had to choose one other element to modify. This is another reason why I chose sort of bubbles, what's the best bubble solution, is because we could look at the same question in different ways. And we had some really good class discussions about the conclusions you can make from each of these 2 scenarios. So if you found a difference in the 2 brands, you wouldn't know exactly how they were different or why they were different, just that they differed in some way. Whereas in the recipe example, if you found a difference, you could more closely tie it to, okay, it's because of the sugar content. This is how adding more sugar or decreasing the sugar affects the response variable that they looked at. So that's why I chose those 2 specific situations, because they led to sort of different ways that you can extend your conclusions to that research question. So that was the research question, sort of the guidelines. The overview of the project. So on the left column of my slide, I kind of have the overview. On the right column are some of the notes and how it ties to class. So they had 2 main components. One of them was a research proposal. It had a page maximum limit. This is where they needed to introduce the research question. And their research question couldn't be left as just determine the best bubble solution. They had to clearly define this research question. They also needed to provide some sort of motivation or rationale for the project. Some groups had a lot of fun with thinking about childhood or weddings or events where you might have bubbles as their motivation. Others took a little bit more of a scientific approach. Those that were maybe manipulating the sugar or the soap looked at it from that way. In this research proposal, I also wanted them to be very clear and specific about their response or explanatory variables, or even any other variables they were going to collect, including explanations and reasonings. So I wanted them to think carefully about the data they were collecting, why they were collecting it, and how it was going to help answer that research question that they refined. So the content that kind of in the research proposals that related to class was defining a research question that can be directly answered through data collection. So they had to define it as how are they going to identify best. So that was a really interesting process watching them go through that. Then we also talked about variables. A lot of that came into the research proposals with whether it be response and explanatory, categorical, quantitative, as well as a little data organization, why they might include certain variables and maybe not collect others. So those were kind of the class components that came in. After they had a research proposal, they then did a data collection plan. This had a 3-page maximum, although I think most were about 2 pages. This plan specifically identified how they would collect their data, outlining the entire process, including their supplies, their setup, their organization of how they were going to carry it out. And in this plan, I wanted them to incorporate data collection and study design components that we had specifically talked about in class. So they needed to think it through. So some of the study design things, such as what variables might they control, or processes might they want to control, where are they going to incorporate randomization, or how might they incorporate randomization. If they were doing the experimental study, what are your treatments, what are the factors, what are the levels, that sort of thing. In this data collection plan, we also talked about reproducible research a little bit. From a written study design perspective. So can you clearly outline your steps, your materials, your processes, so that if somebody wanted to reproduce or carry out your study, if you handed this to somebody else, could they go through it just as you had? So being very clear and intentional with how they're getting their data, how they're collecting it, and the processes they used. Throughout these 2 documents, I stressed the proper use of the statistical terminology. Again, the first bit of content tends to be a lot of vocab words and that sort of thing, and so I wanted them to use those appropriately. And so I wanted to see how they could incorporate some of the concepts and terminologies in that way. Another thing that came about from these 2 that I wasn't initially expecting necessarily, but it was kind of exciting to see, is that the students had to make decisions about their plans, and I always encourage them to consider it from a statistical perspective. So some of the questions that they came up with is, what do we do about the bubble wands? So if they were given the 2 different brands, the little party bubbles have a very small wand and the bigger ones have a larger wand. And so they had to think about, do you use just one wand for both solutions? Do you use the wand that came with the particular brand? And also, okay, if you, whatever way you choose that, then how does that influence what your results mean about the difference between the brands or your research question? Similarly, there are questions about how should we mix the solutions? Should we shake it in a container? Should we stir it? Does it matter how long? And again, I wanted them to think about, okay, if you don't keep this consistent, how does that affect your your results potentially or your data. If you do keep it consistent, why would you do a certain method? So continuing to have them think about these questions and making these decisions considering their data collection plans or what that would mean as far as their results. Another popular one was how do they blow the bubbles? Do you have one person? Do you have multiple people? Do you use a machine? That sort of thing. So this was the two main components that showed up in both of the projects and kind of how I saw them tie into class, particularly with that early content. In this, I kind of did some guided steps. So this wasn't an independent project necessarily. They worked independently in groups, but they had some guidance. So in week 1, they did their research proposals. And here's where we talked about clearly defining a general research question. So going from what is the best bubble solution to what their group was specifically going to examine, as well as thinking about their variables. And then week 2, we got into the data collection plan, so that's where we were going through the study, how you get data, the different sources of it, the elements of a study design, trying to think about controlled variables or potential lurking variables, as well as the procedures of collecting the data. In each class in that beginning, at least those first two weeks and kind of throughout the whole project, I tried to discuss or at least reference the project in each class. And that way they really felt a connection with how what we're doing ties into a bigger picture. It also helped with some of the questions I could have them think about the bubble project because then everybody was sort of on the same page and so they could think about it similarly. So it helped in that way with some formulating of questions. I also built in occasional 15-minute work times at the end of class. If we were doing something in class that specifically sort of related to a component of their project, I would give them a specific task to do in that 10 or 15 minutes. Other times I said, in the last 10 minutes, I want you to meet with your group and maybe check on how your research proposal is coming along because it's due tomorrow or something like that. So sometimes it was directed, other times it was more just you need to meet with your group and then they could ask questions of me during that classwork time. So that's kind of the general overview that I use both semesters. Now I want to talk about kind of specifically how I used the project in the fall versus how it was used in the spring. So the fall timeline, weeks 1 and 2, as kind of what the previous slide indicated, the research proposals and data collection plans were due, or were working on. The research proposal was mainly addressed in class on the week 1, although I didn't have them turn it in because they might want to modify it as they were working on their data collection plan. So at the end of week 2 was when the data collection plan and research proposals were due. Week 3 is when the teams collected their data. And this took place outside of class. So they had to find a time to come to my office, get the supplies they needed, and then go and collect their data. And their data was due at the end of week 3. In week 4, they were to organize and summarize their data, and the project concluded with an in-class presentation day on Friday, the last Friday of the week. And these presentations were about 8 minutes in length. They were asked to give a brief presentation summarizing their process and what they found, and then they used only basic, or not basic, but just numerical and graphical summaries to come up with informal inferences. So we didn't do any hypothesis testing or formal inference procedures. They were just supposed to summarize and see, at least initially, what their data maybe suggest about the best bubble solution. So that was the timeline for the fall. And some of my questions or the things that came up is in weeks 1 and 2, that was really during the ad drop deadline. Our ad drop deadline had to be completed by the Friday of week 2, And so I had to have a little flexibility with groups to account for the fact that some people might be dropping, others might be adding. So that was one thing I had to deal with. Some, as far as the data collection, some loved it. They really enjoyed it. They really got after it. They took pictures. They set it all up. Others kind of thought it was unnecessary and time-consuming. They didn't see it was as meaningful as some of the other components. So there's a mix on the actual data collection. The presentations in class, since there were about 6 groups who all had the same basic research question, by the last few, the presentations became a little repetitive. They were all similar in a way, although there were interesting differences. So the differences were really neat to see, although I think I could even tell by the presenters towards the end they weren't as excited or enthusiastic because some of it was the same information. In the presentations, though, I noticed quite a few errors or flaws, whether that be with how they actually collected their data as they said it or how they presented it. I guess one nice thing is I kept track of some of these, and then I tried to incorporate them into the discussions into future classes. So briefly mention something about, oh, by the way, this relates to our bubble project. Let's take a look at this. I didn't do just the errors or the flaws. I also complemented it with a good example or a really interesting idea or concept or something that groups had done well also. So it wasn't just the errors or the flaws, it was also the good things. But I felt that was a good way of catching some of the misunderstandings about things and incorporating and bringing them into future classes. So an example of something that I brought up in class. So here is 2 charts. We'll look at this one first. Here they put the duration and the number of bubbles on the same box plot. And in their discussion they talked about how number of bubbles was a lot more variable and that sort of thing. And they kind of led to assume that the duration is a better measurement because it has less variability. And so in class we then talked about how these are different scales. Maybe they would look differently if they were graphed individually rather than put on the same one. So you're maybe not seeing the correct representation of this data. So you might consider alternative ways of graphing it. This graph down here, the scatter plot, they looked at the duration in seconds and the size in centimeters, although these were not taken on the same bubbles. And there's a few scatter plots that I saw that came up that were actually taken on different trials even, so it wasn't even related to the one data. So we talked about what this scatter plot would represent, what it doesn't necessarily represent, and how it might be a misconception to put these 2 measurements together when they were not taken on the same units. So these are 2 examples that brought into good discussions into future classes. So that was my fall timeline. After the fall semester, for the spring semester, I wanted to include this, but I decided to try and revamp it a little bit. So weeks 1 and 2 was the same. They still drafted their research proposal and data collection plan. In week 3, instead of collecting data, we peer-reviewed the proposals and the data collection plans. And then in week 4, they were to finalize their research proposals and data collection plans. So we didn't do the data collection or the presentation. It was just purely focused on the proposal and the data collection plan. So with this timeline, I still needed to be some flexibility in groups because there were still a few that added and dropped, although there was still, it didn't seem like it was as much of an issue because the final product was due in week 4 and it was the same product rather than having the data collection plan and research proposal finalized sort of in week 2, and then they're collecting data in week 3 and doing the presentation, so they would have kind of missed the whole research proposal and collection plan. So I still needed to be flexible, although it didn't seem like they were missing out on such a big component. In week 3 for the peer review, I spent a full class where they gave them 2 samples that I created, some drafts that I had put together. I also brought the materials to class. And so in small groups, they were given one of the sample drafts that they were to discuss and peer review. And they were also encouraged to kind of play around with the bubbles, see if the process that was outlined was clear enough, so they could look at the supplies and see if it seemed feasible. So I think that day was very beneficial. At the end of that day, each individual was then given another group's project, and I assigned the projects in a way that the students in one team peer-reviewed. Each student had a different team to peer review. So it wasn't the first team all peer reviewing the second team, but they were peer reviewing separate ones so that they could get an idea for how others were approaching it, maybe get some ideas, as well as just figure out how they would, what comments they would have about that peer review on their groups that they were assigned. And the peer reviews were then due at the end of the week. And then I gave them back to the teams initially so that they could base their revisions on those peer reviews as well as their process of peer reviewing in other groups. So one of the benefits that I saw is that the final research proposals and data collection plans, I use the term higher quality a little loosely because I don't have any evidence they were higher quality. They just seemed more complete, more thought out. There were less kind of questionable things in it than in the fall, although they weren't completely free of errors. Where this group kind of struggled a little bit was the practicality of data collection. Some of them proposed using some very high-tech equipment that I don't think our college even would have access to right now. So how would you actually collect that data? Others proposed using a bubble machine and thinking about how much supplies they actually are given and how much are necessary to work that bubble machine. I don't know if it would have actually worked out. There was also a group who was doing a recipe, and one of their levels was with no soap. And so I don't think I've ever seen sugar and water make bubbles. So just thinking about those types of, well, in practicality, you wouldn't do bubble recipe probably without any soap. So that's where sort of their issues came up is, okay, could you actually carry this out? So that was my spring. So I dropped the data collection and just focused on the research proposals. So to sort of summarize, the students really enjoyed using bubbles, but to adapt for the future or for others out there, I think there are potentially other topics that could be very well modified into a similar type of project. For me, random groups is a must. It gets them working with others as well as tries to eliminate any potential biases or groupings that may naturally happen in the classroom, so it's nice to see that randomization. The students did appreciate the discussions in class about the project and the relation of the material in class to the bubble project. I got quite a few students say that that was very, very beneficial for both the material as well as their project. I think the peer review process was helpful. It's something that I would probably incorporate in the future. How it related to then the final projects at the end of the semester, again, I used improved lightly because I don't have any evidence, but it seems like their research questions, their sort of motivation, their ability to put things together is maybe more improved than what I've seen in previous semesters. I guess one question that I haven't had yet is that I've never done this, or comment. I would sometimes get, I've never done a study, how am I supposed to know? And so I think going through the bubble project where it's a little bit more guided has helped ease those issues of people who maybe haven't done any data collection or research studies. Some things to think about still are the timeline and the add drop period. So depending on when the add drop deadline and how flexible you want to be, you might motivate or change the timeline. I'm still debating about whether collecting data, I think it was helpful in some ways, it maybe wasn't in others. So a potential idea is to use one or two of the projects as a class lab where you collect the data in class. The recipe I gave isn't maybe the best. I've seen others with glycerin or corn syrup, so there are other options. You wouldn't have to follow that recipe, so maybe in the future I might try those. Also, you wouldn't have to modify the recipe. You could find alternative variables, so maybe resting time after you make the solution. One group really wanted to do the type of water, so whether it's deionized, tap water, or like bottled water, looking at effects of wands or method of blowing the bubbles. So really there's a lot of other ways that this project could be taken and adapted. In some ways to maybe simplify it so you wouldn't need the variety of materials or to look at other variables. So that's kind of some of the summaries of my experience through the past 2 semesters. I want to end with that the students are really creative with this project. So these are some of their ways of defining the best bubble. Some of them were duration, and they measured duration in 2 ways. So how long did the bubbles last from a single blow, where it was the timer started on the first bubble and ended when the last one popped. Others just did 1 bubble, so the first bubble from leaving the wand to popping. Size was a big one that was incorporated. It was measured in a variety of ways, either video equipment or iPad using graph paper, measuring mid-air trying to use a ruler or some cards. Some measured on a surface, either by popping it or blowing it actually on the surface. Another variable that some people collected was the reason for popping. Some of them popped in mid-air, some of them popped on contact with the floor, or they popped after contact. The number of bubbles produced, the last 2 are kind of interesting as well with the film length. So essentially how long can you blow bubbles before you're out of that allows you to blow bubbles, so where it becomes empty. As well as effort, so they noted whether, I believe this group blew for 4 seconds, and they noted whether there was solution left on the wand after those 4 seconds, as well as how many attempts were needed to actually form a bubble, because sometimes they would dip it and try and blow, and the film would pop right away without creating a bubble. So overall, I think the students were very creative. They enjoyed it. It seemed like they benefited from it. And so that's kind of my experience with this bubble project. There was a US COTS poster that actually kind of gave me the idea of using bubbles because they're easy to modify, easy to incorporate. And then there's also a paper that I kind of looked at in kind of thinking about how to outline it. So I guess thank you for listening, and I guess if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer or address them.
Thank you so much, Pam. We haven't had any questions yet in chat, but if anybody has any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them in the chat window right now. One question I had was just kind of from the very beginning, when you divide these into groups, does each group consider both the store-bought bubbles and the recipe, or do you kind of randomly assign that out so that not every group is doing both versions of it?
I randomly assigned half the groups to do the store-bought and half of them to do the solution where they make their own.
Okay, so that there was a little bit more. That seems like a good idea, that there's not as much work involved to think about 2 different designs.
Yeah.
And then more variety in the presentations. We have a bunch of quiet attendees today. While we're waiting a few more seconds to see if anyone has any questions, I just want to bring your attention to some upcoming events we have at CAUSE. ECOTS is taking place between May 16th and 20th, and if you've never attended ECOTS before, I encourage you to register for that. It's very inexpensive, and it's a lot of fun to just kind of pop in and talk to people that you've seen at USCOTS meetings before, and to hear what people are doing in between USCOTS events. We also have a teaching and learning webinar coming up on June 14th, and Chris Malone will be our presenter there, and another activity webinar on June 28th with Kyle Cottle as the presenter, if you'd like to put those on your calendar and keep your eyes open for announcements about those. All right, it looks like we don't have any other questions, so Pam, is there anything else you wanted to say?
Not really. I mean, if you have questions or future questions or want to see some of the materials or something, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer any questions or things that come up later as well. So.
All right, well, thank you again for presenting, and thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you at ECOTS coming up next month.